Kanban from the inside, 2014, that seems like an age ago. Was that seven years now? A Lean Agile classic, I think it's fair to describe that book. Right to left, the Digital Leader's Guide to Lean and Agile. What I was doing there was presenting an outcome-oriented perspective on the Lean Agile landscape. I kind of sensing the frustration of so many people whose experience of Agile was one of heads down, plowing through backlogs. Such a mediocre experience delivering such mediocre results. When those of you motivated to come to to meetups and stuff like that, your experience of Agile is probably very different and so much better than that. One of pursuing things that matter. An outcome-oriented view, needs met, outcomes realized, the learning captured from that experience. And that being the engine of delivery and also of development of the team and of the organization. So it was right to left. An agenda shift is very much focused on the change part of that. How do we put agreement on outcomes ahead of solutions? How do we completely turn that traditional change management view of starting with a solution and selling it to people, starting with a big framework, for example, and selling it to people, overcoming resistance to change, all that stuff, the pain of implementation, and then the disappointment that the results aren't what were sold to us. Turn that completely around. Let's put agreements on outcomes first with the right people in the room, which is really everybody's going to be impacted by change. Everyone who's expected to work differently, everyone whose relationship with the organization is expected to change. Let's agree some outcomes that matter and that the solutions follow that. That completely changes it. That doesn't mean that frameworks don't matter, but it means that we approach the frameworks from the perspective of the outcomes that we want to achieve. It makes the whole thing more granular. It makes the whole thing more humane. So that's really where agenda shift is coming from. What if we put agreement on outcomes ahead of solutions, authentic agreement, the right people in the room, and the outcomes that are meaningful. When I say meaningful, a lot more meaningful than 10% more for 5% less. Meaningful in terms of someone's need met, the happy ending to a story, the world changed for someone. Significant, not just the significance of things, not just the quantity of things. So that's what we're getting at with outcomes. Does, however, raise a whole load of challenges, and that's really what this, what this is about. So, how do we go forward with authentic agreement on meaningful outcomes? Well, the first challenge is, that involves a whole new set of conversations that we're not used to having. We're actually very ill-equipped to have. We are so used to focusing on solutions, either the big solution, the big rollout, where where the solution becomes the objective, rather than the business objective driving the solution, or we choose the first solution we think of that might help to solve our problem, or we focus on that. We actually need to change the language. We need to help people understand how to have conversations around things like needs, obstacles, and outcomes, the language of outcomes. Next challenge is turning the results of those kind of conversations into a strategy. I think when people have been, in the last few years, been thinking about, what's the alternative to big waterfall style change, the answer has often been evolutionary change. And even my first book, that's probably the paradigm that was the dominant alternative paradigm to manage change, when that book was written in 2014. But I think quite rightly, organizations and leaders are a little skeptical. Where's the strategy there? How do we know where evolution is going to take us? And what's great about starting to think about conversations about outcomes, we can actually organize the results of those outcomes into a strategy. We can even visualize it. We can use that to help drive the planning, the delivery process, the experimentation process, the ideation process, all those kinds of things. So that stuff's important. And that leads us to innovation at the edges, solutions emerging from the people closest to the problem. What are the tools to do that effectively? How do we keep that process moving forward at a really good rate? And that the rate of experimentation being the driver for the rate of change of the organization. And lastly, how do we sustain all that? How do we make it sustainable in in the human sense? How can this be a process that we can actually enjoy working under? How can this work at that human level, at the individual level, at the level of individuals relating to each other, growing in their roles, growing into expanded roles, starting to look differently at their relationship with their organization? How does this work at team level? How does this work at levels above the team? The departments, divisions, whatever, the organization as a whole, business agility at every scale. So there's some big questions there, but they're the kind of questions that I like. So welcome to Agenda Shift, the wholehearted and outcome-oriented engagement model. Now, I'm not going to define a wholehearted or engagement model or even outcome-oriented just yet, but we'll kind of get to there by the end of the talk. But that's the space we're in. That's what we're about. So let's dig into new kinds of conversation. I'm going to start with, I kind of alluded to this already, but what do I mean by an outcome? So I don't mean 10% more for 5% less, 5% less. I mean things that are genuinely meaningful to the most possible number of people in the organization, meaningful even to your customers and sponsors and other stakeholders and so on. And I start with my definition of done. So fun little meme. My definition of done: someone's need was met. agendashift.com/done. So someone's need was met. We helped somebody overcome a struggle and reach some happy ending. In a little story, a little job story, if you like. The world changed for someone in some meaningful way. And this is actually a very good starting point. We can start to ask questions like whose need, by what means, how do we know that their need has been met, and so on. And that's a great way of framing agile delivery. And it's also a good way of framing change as well, understanding questions like those. So going from there to really why the Agenda Shift second edition, and it's because so much of this process has become so much clearer in the 3 or 4 years since the first edition, and it made writing the second edition a really big opportunity. And one of the clarifying things is this pattern. It's called the I-Do pattern. I-Do as a mnemonic for ideal, obstacles, outcomes, and it's a really handy pattern. It started out as like the structure of workshops, maybe a day's worth of workshop, maybe a couple of hours worth of workshop. Ideal, exploring what would great look like. What would it be like if this was working at its ideal best for us? Those kind of questions. And then obstacles. Well, what gets in the way of that? Why is it that we don't have that now? And from those obstacles, outcomes. What would we like to have happen? And then what happens? So, those kinds of questions. So that's where that started, and it started as a structure to help organize, a number of different exercises. But this could be a leadership routine. 3 or 4 quick questions, this thing over in moments. You can think of this as a coaching pattern. If you're familiar with the GROW model, for example, or Toyota Carter, you can think of the GROW model, which, like a lot of coaching patterns, is about getting someone to their next commitment. The Toyota Carter pattern kind of steps back from that a bit. Here's where we want to get to, and we're recognizing that there are going to be some obstacles along the way that we're going to have to experiment our way through. And the I-Do pattern is about the strategic landscape in which all of that takes place. A strategic landscape modeled in the language of obstacles and outcomes. It's not necessarily a completely linear thing. I mean, from any outcome or even any obstacle, you can go back to and find a new ideal. Why is that important? Why is that important? You get towards a new kind of ideal. You can ask what obstacle is in the way of an outcome. It can be a twisty, fractal type landscape, but a really easy pattern to remember, a really easy pattern to learn and to practice. And identifying this pattern and a couple of other patterns it's done two things which almost sound contradictory, and it's great that we've managed to pull it off. We've made agenda shift easier to explain and less prescriptive at the same time. And it was never meant to be prescriptive, but people always understood it as, there's these exercises and you do them in this kind of order. And drawing out the pattern makes the patterns and the principles behind those patterns far more important than the individual exercises that we've developed and used over the years. That's the I do pattern. Where you start the I do pattern is a choice. Now, at this point, very often I'll be doing breakouts. I don't think we'll be doing breakouts today. But if we were to do a breakout, it would likely be based on these words as something to reflect on. So this comes from an exercise we often do as part of a discovery exercise, all very high level, not very, not down in the detail, not down in the weeds, but our true north statement. So imagine everyone able to work consistently at their ideal best. Individuals, teams, between teams, across the organization and beyond. Right conversations, right people, best possible moment, needs anticipated, met at just the right time. Now, if we were doing this in a workshop, I'd give you a minute maybe to just reflect on that silently. If we were together in the room rather than online, I might have some discussions in pairs, and then people would move to their breakout groups, breakout rooms, depending on whether online or in the room. What I'd like you to do is just to chat a sentence or even just a word. If that was working at its ideal best for you, what would that be like? Or you could ask the question, what's happening? But what would that be like? What's happening? Two questions for you. And just a quick line in chat. I'll count to 10 slowly. Hopefully we'll get a chat or two in that time. So what's happening when that's working at its ideal best for you? What's that like when that's working at its ideal best for you? Nirvana, says Brian. Wonderful, yes, exactly. Hard to expect they will consistently occur. Well, for now, we're just going to enjoy it. Then we move on to, well, what stops that? What gets in the way? And you could answer that question now. What stops that? What gets in the way? Again, I'll count to 10 slowly in my head. Different agendas, that's a good answer. Any more? It's hard to be consistent when different people are pulling in different directions, for example. So maybe this question is going to be aimed at Brian. Given what you would like to achieve, different agendas, no, getting more, they're all coming now. So that always happens with obstacles. No alignment toward the organizational strategy, inconsistent skills, and so on. So relative to all of those, what would you like to have happen? Again, one sentence, what would you like to have happen? The outcome that's achievable behind those obstacles. Again, I'll count to 10 slowly in my head. So what outcomes are available to you if you can find a way past those obstacles? Fresh ideas explored. That's a good one. So pride, afraid of being wrong, that's an obstacle. Fear of failure, all those kinds of things. Judgment or judge-free zone. People don't feel judged, and that's where they can feel safe and can be themselves, be their best, contribute their best, psychological safety, and so on. I'm going to ask one more question. So based on those good things that you're now thinking and some of you are chatting, then what happens? So when you have psychological safety, a judgment-free zone, then what happens? Whatever obstacle you had in your head, whatever outcome you had in your head, what happens after that? Establish an environment that allows minimizing the obstacles and let teams add value. Allow teams to experiment. Experimentation, innovative thinking, improved outputs and happier customers. I could ask that again, given experiments and innovative thinking, then what happens? And probably we get to happier teams, happier customers, all those kind of things. It doesn't take long. In a few minutes to a few hours of exercise, it's amazing what kind of model you can build of obstacles and outcomes for your organization. And it's based not on someone's prescription of how the process should work. It's anchored in your present reality, but also there's a vision there of where it is you would like to get to. And you are from the beginning bought into finding solutions, finding ways forwards, and you might look at your frameworks to do that. You might look in other places. So I'll move on from those exercises. I said where you start is a choice. We started with the true north statement there. You can imagine reaching the right customers, meeting their strategic needs. We're starting here, not focus on our process, but starting with our customers. And this is actually, I've just taken a little snippet from our outside-in strategy review. So it's a strategy review that starts at the customer and we work our way in organization, product, platform, teams. So it's a great way of re-energizing a team, revitalizing a whole organization. And we've done whole organization strategy reviews this way, starting from the outside with the customer and the business environment the organization sits in, and working our way inwards, not just starting with process, with capability and thinking about how to develop them, but starting with things that from the beginning are meaningful. So that's one. You could provide your own. If you're a facilitator, you may be familiar already with the idea of introducing a challenge, a challenge question, a generative image. The examples you've seen so far, they're all examples of that. Here's another one. We treat work as unfinished until we confirm that customer needs have been met. This is a much lower level of detail now compared to the true north. This is actually one of our assessment prompts. So this is interesting. An assessment where every prompt in the assessment is itself capable of challenging and inspiring. And from the 42 prompts of the assessment, we leave it to the participants to decide which of them are important to them, which ones they want to have more conversations about, which ones they want to identify the obstacles to, the outcomes, and so on, and use the assessment as a way of generating a strategy at a lower level of detail, that sort of ways of working level of detail. And I just want to sort of mention that good assessments are exercises in trust building. We take a lot of care with the wording of the assessment to make it not just accessible, but sort of authentic. Authentically, we are writing statements that we expect the majority of people to buy into. We're not using the assessment to teach people the framework. We're not using the assessment to be a checklist of best practices. If you're really wanting to understand what's going on in the organization, doing either of those two things is inauthentic. And people smell inauthenticity a mile away, and it makes them cynical. You don't want to do that. You want an assessment that is designed carefully. The way you use it needs to be careful. And we use it in a way not to judge people in a diagnostic kind of way, but we use it to have some fantastic conversations in what's called a dialogic and generative kind of way. A little bit more on obstacles. And this is, again, another sort of improvement since the first edition. So between 2017, 2018, and 2021, we've understood that how obstacles get framed is actually really important. So you may get an obstacle like lack of a knowledge management system, for example. I got that obstacle in the very first workshop I ever did. That lack of was that's a bad smell. That's in that case, someone selling a solution. Lack of the agile mindset, well, that's someone selling a theory that many people wouldn't subscribe to in the organization or might not subscribe to in the organization. They might feel judged by that kind of language. And we've learned how to recognize the kind of obstacles that either make people feel judged or make people feel that they're being sold to. And if you want to have some great conversations with people about change, you don't want to do either of those things. Those are like the classic mistakes of change, is to make people feel judged or sold to. So in their small groups, we get people to actually work quite hard on how they frame those obstacles. And when you frame the obstacles well, the conversations that you have about them afterwards are that much more productive. And what those conversations look like? Well, very often they're with our clean language inspired coaching game, 15-minute photo. So this is like many of the Agenda Shift resources is open source. You can get hold of the materials for this. You can watch a video of it as well. So we're asking questions like, well, what would you like to have happen? And then what happens? You've heard me use those questions already. What kind of? Where does that come from? And these are questions where the person asking the question can't impose their own assumptions into the conversation. We are genuinely listening to the client in this conversation. So we are teaching people how to have conversations about outcomes that are authentic, curious, high quality conversations, because we're really giving people a chance to actually work out in their own minds what it is they want to achieve. Again, in terms of improvements since the first edition, the classic version of 15-minute photos, some of you may have seen this already. The game is played in roles: client, coach, scribe, and observer. And it's actually very intense, one-to-one conversation between the client and the coach. We now have a light version, which is just an informal table group discussion. Anyone can ask a question, anyone can answer, you can even answer your own question. And that means that we can easily introduce people to the concepts, to the questions, to the, why we do it this way and all the rest of it, before people are confronted with an experience that's different to what they're used to. When we get this right, it is fantastic. We've had the new joiner coach someone from the C-suite and vice versa. Coaching, this is this radical idea. If I'm in a room full of coaches, coaching not just for coaches, but as a leadership practice, a leadership discipline, but also we are injecting something new into the way the organization talks to each other, helping them understand how to get beyond solutions to outcomes. So really, really fundamental stuff. So that's 15-minute photos, something you see the link on the page there. If you go to agendashift.com, there's a resources page with a ton more stuff than that. So that'll do for new kinds of conversation. Next up is adaptive strategy. Now, strategy is a very big topic. It's a favorite topic of mine. What I'm going to talk about today isn't the whole thing about strategy, but just the idea of organizing outcomes into something strategic. And you'll begin to see how continuous transformation isn't just evolution. It's not just trying a few things and seeing what sticks. There can be a real strategy to it. There can be some objectives that we're identifying areas of uncertainty where learning is going to have to happen. We can identify constraints, obstacles that we accept, for example. All the hallmarks of strategy, of good strategy, we can apply here. So very simple visualization of outcomes. We could take all the outcomes that you put into chat, and we could organize them short-term, medium-term, long-term. Stick them all in the medium-term column and spread them. Spread the long-term ones go one way, the short-term ones go the other. So the long-term ones, things that sound aspirational. The short-term ones, things that we can work on right away. And hopefully the ones in the middle are like the signs that you're winning, that we're on the way to those longer-term things. What we can then do is actually work backwards. So for each of our aspirations, do we know what are the signs that we are winning in our pursuit of that aspirational goal? And given each of those signs that you're winning, can we point to places where we might start? So, this already is, the beginnings of strategy. It's also what people in the OD community, the organization development community, call a theory of change. We are beginning to model the relationships between outcomes, how one outcome impacts another outcome, and so on. It's all very loose, all very informal here, but it's certainly a good start. And then the outside-in strategy review I mentioned, well, here's a template for it, and that same idea again. Ideal obstacles, outcomes across the top, short-term, medium-term, long-term within the outcomes column, and going down the side, customer, organization, product, platform, teams, and some challenge questions to go with those. You can just answer those questions and fill this out. In practice, there's a whole load of material behind this that lets us dig into different aspects of the strategy, different kinds of customers, for example, the competitive ecosystem from an organization perspective, things like whole products and competitor products and service versus products in the product space, all these different considerations. And then, our goal then is to come up with some inspiring and challenging ideals, come up with some obstacles that currently face us, and then organize some outcomes into something that's at least the beginning of strategy. And we can do a lot better than short-term, medium-term, long-term. Our mapping module has 3 main mapping exercises: option approach mapping, option relationship mapping, pathway mapping. What they have in common, especially the first 2, but it's true to an extent of the third one. What we don't do is stick all the sticky notes up on the board, dot vote, cluster, and in so doing, throw away 90% of the information. So what we're doing instead, we're finding the corners, stretching things out, finding the sides, finding the top and the bottom, stretching, arranging outcomes between those extremes, so that we can then identify the relationships between them and draw them. So a good example of this is the middle one of those exercises, option relationship mapping. Put them along a line in terms of how ambiguous they are. So the ones on the left here, highly ambiguous. We need to learn about what it is we want to achieve. We need to learn about, what obstacles in the way. We need to learn about what possible solutions we need to find, as opposed to the things on the right where it's pretty clear, what the issue is. It's pretty clear what needs to be done. So that's an interesting scale, and how you approach those different things is going to be different. And then we stretch them out vertically according to how visible they are to the customer. And very often you get things at the bottom right, the easy things to do are easy from a team's perspective, but they have very little effect on the customer. But perhaps we can find an outcome that's accessible to the team, but has an impact on something that the customer is going to benefit from, is going to see, going to experience. And we can draw lines between these things. We can, look at different possible strategies and decide which is the one that we're going to pursue. This is called option relationship mapping. It was invented by 2 friends of mine, Liz Keogh and Carl Scotland, who you may know. It's inspired by the Knevin framework and Wardley mapping. So Wardley mapping is a great way of doing very similar diagrams, but with capabilities and components. We are doing mapping with outcomes, and as a strategy tool, we love it. So that's adaptive strategy. Innovation at the edges. Solutions emerging from the people closest to the problem. And kind of channeling the right to left book here, I love to work backwards. What we want to get to is what's called double loop learning, or a technical term from organizational psychology. Double loop learning means we didn't just learn a fact, we learned about ourselves in the process. We challenged some of our own assumptions. We tested our own process and found it wanting and want to change it. So if you're in digital delivery, for example, you didn't just deploy the code, you deployed the code, your users are using it, you were able to measure how your users used it. You learned something about the customers through that process, and you realize, well, you made some faulty assumptions at the beginning, and those faulty assumptions were because of other things that you could you might want to challenge. Your process for testing all of that took way too long, and there was a better way that you could organize yourself. That's kind of a sort of specific version of what double loop learning looks like. If you're doing really good retrospectives, you are challenging some of your core assumptions. You are challenging why we did it in this way. What were we thinking? And could we organize ourselves differently and achieve the result that we achieved more effectively? It's not just about process, it's about really fundamental things, but that's what double loop learning is about. We need some way of organizing our portfolio of experiments. My change ban game is actually quite a fun way of teaching that. So change ban is it's a simulation game based on Kanban and Lean Startup. If you've seen my feature ban game, it's a Lean Startup flavored version of feature ban. And we are teaching how you can think of your development process as asking different questions at each stage of the process. And you can think of one way of improving your process is thinking about how do we make sure that it asks the right questions at the right time? How do we make sure those questions really are asked? How do we make sure we really act on the answer to those questions? And how do we reflect on whether they're the right questions to ask? All that kind of stuff. That's change ban. And going into that, you have experiments. So you choose an outcome that you want to pursue. You come up with a number of ideas for how you might move towards that outcome. You frame that idea as a hypothesis. You develop that into an experiment that you then conduct. That's how that process works. And we borrow a bit from design thinking and various other places, ways to enliven that ideation process, how to come up with lots of ideas, how to prioritize ideas, how to mash ideas together, all this kind of thing. And we remind people also that those outcomes, they come from somewhere, they come from a strategy. We're not just having a retrospective and deciding to fix the first problem that we think of. When teams do that, if that's all they do, there's a good chance that they're optimizing for comfort. And there are much better things to optimize for. Comfort's important, but it's not the overall goal. Comfortable environments can be productive environments, but if that's what you're optimizing for, there's a good chance that actually you make it worse for some of your other stakeholders, for your customers, and even in the long run yourselves. Once the process starts to get inward looking, it starts to lose meaning, and that can be a problem. Another little a little mnemonic, 2MBM, meaning before metric, measure before method. I never want to start with something like 10% more for 5% less. I don't want to start with more velocity. I don't want to start with higher net promoter score. I don't want to start with shorter lead time. If someone starts with one of those, I want to know why that's important, why that's meaningful. But those kind of metrics and lots of other metrics are actually important. If you work out how you're going to measure your success in achieving an outcome, that can actually give you some solution ideas. So that's helpful. So that's measure before method. And chapter 4 of the book is based around that kind of pattern, making sure we understand why we want to pursue that outcome, coming up with some great ideas to help deliver that outcome. And part of the process of coming up with those ideas is thinking about how we would measure success. And it ties all really well with things like OKR and things like that, objectives and key results. That's innovation at the edges, and lastly, business agility at every scale. So I described at the beginning, I described agenda shift as an engagement model. And I didn't define it, but an engagement model has 3 jobs to do. So an engagement model is a way to help leaders, practitioners, coaches, change agents engage with the change challenge, so we say, give it some structure, give them some helpful tools. And and at one level, that's what agenda shift is. At another level, an engagement model, you want staff engaged. That is both a goal in itself, but also it's a necessary thing if you want some great ideas to emerge in this process. And if your goal is something cultural, something transformative from a culture point of view, like Agile should be, where you want people collaborating, where you want people innovating, you need to get that. It's worth getting that stuff right from the beginning. And actually, your change process can model what we want it to look like, when we're being successful. So it's a bit of a pun there, the engagement model. It's a term that Daniel Mesick used in the foreword to the first edition. I didn't use the word in the first edition at all. It's a really helpful word, engagement model. It's how we engage, and engagement is actually a goal. There's a third meaning. I'm sort of stretching the meaning of the word engagement slightly, but you need to think about, well, when the organization is changing, different people, different teams tend to change at different speeds. How do we keep the organization still engaged with itself when that's happening? And starting to pay attention to how organizations work. So that's the second common denominator to all of this. So the first common denominator was engagement. The second common denominator is organization. And in the second edition of the book, we take organization really, really seriously. The last few chapters are devoted very much to organization, leadership, structures, feedback loops, all those kind of things. And it's led to our mission statement. We're in the business of building wholehearted and deliberately adaptive organizations. Wholehearted came from my book, Right to Left, and the agenda shift community just got very excited about that word, and we realized we were onto something. And actually, it's mostly about that excitement in a funny way. I don't want to define it too precisely. Different people take away different things from the idea of wholeheartedness. Deliberately adaptive is rather more technical. Business agility at every scale is where it takes us to. We've got a model for scale that works at the team level, it works at the organizational level, it works at the people level, and so on. Just for the technically minded of you, it's agenda shift plugged into the viable system model, which is this scary, complicated picture on the left. But we do it in such a way that actually makes it a ton easier to understand. And so the 10,000-foot view of it looks like this. We can drill down into each of those boxes and use this to help understand how organizations work, how organizations need to work if they're going to work for people, how organizations need to work if they're going to thrive when the world around them is changing. So that's what the deliberately adaptive organization is all about. And from there, we can ask different questions like, well, who's participating? Stop thinking in terms of information flows, now thinking about participation and engagement actually as part of the solution, not just part of the process and how we work out what it is we're trying to do. So that's agenda shift, authentic agreement on meaningful outcomes as the starting point, a game-changing starting point. It completely flips 180 degrees the perspective on change if you're comparing it with traditional solution-driven managed change. So do encourage you to read the book, the second edition, March 2021 as the second edition, and watch this space. There's a ton happening. The book doesn't mean we're finished. The book is a stake in the ground. That's where we are in 2021, and there is a ton of stuff still happening. We launched the Academy this year, and as well as the interactive workshops that we do online, we've launched self-paced training as well. Leading with Outcomes has been going since May. And the first few students are finishing Leading with Outcomes. Outside in Strategy, as self-paced training. That's going to be out in the next few weeks. I'm recording that now. Recording is going very well. And by the end of the year, transforming with outcomes. That's really focused on that deliberately adaptive organization, business agility at every scale, all that kind of stuff. And as an input to that, a new assessment, the deliberately adaptive organization assessment. And we are just piloting that now. We're the first versions of that went to the Agenda Shift partners just last week. So that's very new. Anyone interested in participating in a pilot of that, then do let me know. So that's me done, I think. I will stop sharing. Very happy to take questions. I think Mindy will moderate the questions bit. If I work out how to stop sharing. And that's me done. Thank you very much for listening.
Yes, feel free to
There
unmute or type them in the chat box, whatever you feel like doing. Any questions?
Well, while we're waiting for questions, I will just put agendashift.com in the chat. There's a ton of resources there, free, open source, Creative Commons resources, and a lot of other things. You know, information about the framework, information about the training and stuff that we do.
We do have somebody asking if the deck will be shared.
I can send you a PDF to share. Yes, okay. I can do that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And once Mike shares it, I will share it in our LinkedIn event page. Any other questions? Feel free. You can unmute yourself. You can type them in the chat box, whatever you like.
And I don't mind hard questions. They're often the
okay, and we have, can you talk a little bit more about the specific measures commonly used to measure success?
That's a good question. So it does, it does depend on the context. It depends on the customer. It depends on the things. I suppose I should think about I'll make it specific. I'll go to a particular project. So one of those government digital projects I was involved in was, well, the two I did were Carers Allowance, which was a very popular project in the UK. It's amazing to talk about government IT projects being popular and successful. It's been a privilege to work on those. Carers Allowance and Find an Apprenticeship. So Carers Allowance is, what we're trying to do is to make sure that for those who are eligible to apply, that the process is as easy and quick and painless as it possibly can be. And for those who aren't eligible to apply, they are told that as soon as possible so they don't waste their time and hours going through the process. So we have metrics, a lot of them are actually usability metrics. How long does it take to get through the process? We look very, very carefully about drop-off rates from one stage of the process to another. And are we dropping off the people we want to drop off, or are people leaving in frustration? We would look at things like people moving from an old platform to a new platform. We would look at, we might get the equivalent of net promoter scores, some metrics on how happy they were with the process. There might be some metrics about the rate of change, that how quickly are we able to deliver changes to the service, and so on and so on and so on. All the usual kinds of metrics about performance and reliability and quality and so on, but also some metrics that are specific to the context. And we spent a lot of time actually talking to people, so making sure we understood what their pain points were, what their struggles were, and then making sure that the system is best designed to meet them. If you're familiar with Jobs to be Done, job stories, customer struggles, the Bob Moesta book, all that kind of stuff. This is the kind of stuff we were doing, even, not 10 years ago, but certainly, 6, 7, 8 years ago in the government digital space. More recently, embedded devices, done this stuff with non-profits, internationally known, non-profits, people in finance, people in engineering. Each of them need to work out for themselves what are first of all, the outcomes that they want to pursue as an organization, the outcomes that they want to pursue as teams, and then for specific changes that they're going to make, what would be the signs of success for that change? Yeah.
Okay, and then could you talk a bit more about the techniques and/or tools that you use to overcome change resistance?
Yeah. So one thing, I'm going to be quite blunt, and some of you might even think I'm being rude here. I actually think that the change industry's obsession with resistance to change is a real problem, and it's a sign that there's a paradigm shift is necessary. We are trying to do cultural change by imposing solutions on them, imposing frameworks, for example, on people, and people don't feel that they're part of the process. People don't feel that anyone has asked them, well, what are the frustrations that you feel today? Are those going to be addressed by the framework and so on? There's just, organizations are taking on trust that the solution is going to deliver all the benefits. And we all know that that rarely happens. And I wish that we would use resistance to change as a sign that we've gone about things the wrong way, that we've not involved people in the process, that people haven't had a chance to share their frustrations, for example. You actually build trust by giving people the opportunity to share their problems. If people feel listened to, if they feel that their leaders understand their problems, whether it's the leader's job to take those problems away or not, that's important as a trust building process. If people have the opportunity to articulate in their own words what it is they would like to achieve, and what obstacles they would like to overcome and so on, they're already invested in helping to find solutions. So I don't obsess about overcoming change resistance. I obsess instead about participation. How can we get people participating in the process? How can we get them engaged? How can we make the way we introduce change, do it in a way that's coherent and consistent with our goals for the organization, how we want the organization to be.
Okay, and we have metrics to measure success of organizational change process changes.
Yep, I'm not, as with the previous question about metrics, I'm not going to give one answer to that. It actually depends on what it is you want to achieve. If someone says the only metric, if some expert is telling your organization the only metric that matters is net promoter score or lead time or velocity or whatever it might be, honestly, I would show them the door. They're not doing enough to work out or to understand, or even to help you understand what it is you are trying to achieve and how you would measure success. So I would answer that question with a question: how would you measure success for any particular kind of change you're trying to do?
Okay, and we have, can this type of approach be brought to any organization, or is there a recommended organization maturity? Are there signs of an organization are there signs an organization is ready?
That's a really good question. I'll say, first of all, we've done it, I've mentioned already, we've done this with a wide variety of organizations. I guess the majority of them are in the technology space, but many of them weren't. In terms of maturity, I don't think it's dependent on organizations being mature. Kind of be a bit chicken and egg if you had to be a mature organization before you could try this. It does take a certain amount of courage. It does take at least one leader to say, let's give this a try. You need someone to sponsor someone like this. if you're going to do it at any scale in an organization. That said, individual practitioners get trained in this. A lot of agile coaches are getting trained in this kind of thing as a conversational technique to use with their teams, but also one, hopefully, that they will be using with sponsors, leaders in the organization, and getting them, not by being teachy, preachy about it, but just modeling some different behaviors, help those leaders articulate what it is what they want to achieve. And that's actually a really useful leadership skill. Articulating outcomes is something that leaders need to be doing actually all the time. That's one thing. Stop. They need to be articulating outcomes until they're bored of articulating them. Perhaps by then there's a chance that everyone actually is in agreement about what outcomes we are pursuing. Taking that to another level is actually inviting people to participate in the process of defining what those outcomes are. Not every leader is ready for that, but if you can find a leader that is ready for that, then that's going to be exciting.